My co-panelists and I will talk amongst ourselves for approximately 30 to 45 minutes, after which time I will open up the discussion for questions from you, the audience. And I'd like to ask, if you are in the audience, that you make sure you turn off your microphone so that the only sound we hear is from the panelists. All right, here we go. Jordan Alexandria Ealey is a doctoral candidate in theater and performance studies at the University of Maryland, where she is also pursuing graduate certificates in critical theory and digital studies in the arts and humanities. Ealey's dissertation focuses on Black women-authored musicals from the 19th century to the present. Ealey is published in the Black Scholar, Frontiers, Studies in Musical Theater, and Theater Journal. Ealey is also the co-host and the co-producer of Daughters of Lorraine, a podcast on Black theater from a Black feminist perspective, supported by HowlRound Theater Commons, a dramaturg and a playwright. Welcome. Dr. Paul Edwards is an assistant professor of English at Southern Methodist University and a book review editor for The Black Scholar. Dr. Edwards is currently a fellow at the Center for Ballet and the Arts at New York University. Dr. Edwards' current book project, The Black Wave, examines how the entrance of Black American arts transformed the cultural landscape of German society between two world wars. Dr. Edwards is published in the Black Power Encyclopedia, the Black Scholar, the Encyclopedia of the Harlem Renaissance, German Studies Review, Modern Drama, Modernism/Modernity, and TDR/The Drama Review. Welcome. Dr. Imani Johnson, an assistant professor of dance at the University of California, Riverside, is an interdisciplinary scholar specializing in the African diaspora, global popular culture, and hip hop. Dr. Johnson's doctoral work on international hip hop dance communities is the basis for her manuscript titled Dark Matter and Breaking Ciphers. Dr. Johnson is published in Alif, the Cambridge Companion to Hip Hop, and Women and Performance. Welcome. Dr. Sharrell Luckett is the director of the Helen Weinberger Center for Drama and Playwriting and a professor of theater and performance studies at the University of Cincinnati, where she is also an affiliated faculty member at the College Conservatory of Music and in Africana Studies and Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Dr. Luckett was recently appointed to the Independent Equity Committee at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama in London. In 2021, she was honored by Black Masks magazine as one of 25 game changers in the field. She was also recently nominated for the Paul Robeson Award of the Writers' Equity Association. Dr. Luckett and Dr. Tia M. Schaffer's award-winning and #1 best-selling book collection, Black Acting Methods, introduced and defined the field of Black acting methods. This achievement made Dr. Luckett and the work of her Black Acting Method Studio vanguards in the movement to transform the way we teach performing arts. Dr. Luckett's other books and book collections include African American Arts, Terrell Alvin McCraney, Trans Weight, and Young, Gifted, and Fat. Dr. Luckett has also directed Lydia Diamond's The Bluest Eye, McCraney's In the Red and Brown Water, Lynn Nottage's Ruined, Susan Laurie Parks's Top Dog Underdog, and Sophocles' Oedipus the King. A proud member of Actors Equity Association, Dr. Luckett recently starred in Dominique Morisseau's Pipeline at Ensemble Theater. Prior to that, she served as the production dramaturg for Nottage's Ruined at Hattie Lou Theater. Dr. Luckett's solo show, Young, Gifted, and Fat, has been performed off-Broadway and tours regularly. Welcome. Dr. Rashida Z. Shaw McMahon is an associate professor of English and an affiliated faculty member in African American Studies and Theater at Wesleyan University. Her book, The The Black Circuit examines quote-unquote Chitlin Circuit theatrical productions and the reception practices of African-American spectators. Dr. Shaw is published in Hemispherica and Media Res, Theater Research International, and Theater Topics, as well as in Black Theater is Black Life, From Medea to Media Mogul, The New Black Sociologists, The Palgrave Handbook of Musical Theater Producers, and Sticky Reputations. Her current projects include an investigation into the public exhibition of children to the Danish West Indies and early 20th century Denmark, investigations into the hypervisibility of African-American women characters within the plays of August Wilson, and examinations of the politics of Black pleasure and Black joy as presented within African-American drama and performance. Welcome. And last, but certainly not least, Dr. Daron S. Williams is an assistant professor of theater, directing, dramaturgy, and cultural performance at Eastern Connecticut State University. Dr. Williams is co-editing the book collection Contemporary Black Theater and Performance, and is also published in Continuum and the Journal of American Drama and Theater. Dr. Williams is also an associate member of the Stage Directors and Choreographers Society and has also directed McCraney's The Brother Size, Bruce Norris's Clybourne Park, and Regina Taylor's Crowns. Welcome. All right, so why don't we jump into our first question. Who or what, whether a performer you see in childhood or an incident you experience later on, has led you to your research question? And this discussion will be popcorn style, so you can jump in and jump out as you wish.
Could you repeat it one more time?
Yes, absolutely. Who or what, whether a performer you see in childhood or an incident you experience later on, has led you to your research question?
Well, I guess I'll take the first bite of the popcorn. When I first saw this question, one of the things that came to my mind was the images of, or the cartoon caricature images of Josephine Baker performing in Paris, and in particular the images of Paul Colin as this sort of young French illustrator who had done these images of Josephine Baker. I sort of wish I could pull them up for you if I had been more prepared, but this sort of image of her sort of wide-hipped, smiling Black men behind her has, at least in my own work, sort of really made me want to sort of question what do these images do versus what we see in performance? How do these images sort of stand in for those performances in particular? And I think Josephine Baker in particular, as she figures into my own work, is to do some archiving of seeing how she portrayed and thought about herself as opposed to how others thought about her, and especially her French audiences. And even as my book thinks more about Germany, it's very clear that the navigation of European circuits of entertainment were infused with ideas of colonialism, and bringing over African-American concepts of performance, modernity, etc., were really interesting to me. And that really helped sort of launch my own work, thinking about what is Josephine Baker saying about herself? What is she doing in performance? And what are Europeans saying about that performance? And what are the differentiations that emerge out of these moments?
Yes, I'll jump in. In my work, I talk a lot about, I was inspired and influenced by Freddie Hendricks. I study Black performance methodologies, specifically acting from a Black American aesthetic by way of West African traditions. And I was reared in the Black Mecca, Atlanta, and my drama director all the way in high school was an African-American theater director who devised full-length musicals with 99.9% Black students of the diaspora. And when I began teaching as a high school theater teacher, it was the absence of those Black folks that I now talk about, that I noticed, I would say, teaching methodologies from white folks, that a lot of those formations that we would do, like the circle or even improvisation, were derived from African traditions, and the absence of Black people and all of this whiteness is what led me to my work today.
I can jump in, take a bite of the popcorn. So I'm coming to this PhD that I hold in theater and drama from two places that carry through in my work. So I'm from a majority Black island, which is St. Croix in the United States Virgin Islands. And on that island is where I discovered acting. And as a performer, it was readily apparent to me, even as a teenager, that on this predominantly Black island, the spectators in the audience were majority white spectators. And that has carried through with me to this, through to this first book, which was on the Chitlin circuit. And that opened up all of these questions to me about Black spectatorship and why is this happening? What is happening here? And from that, I've come to talk about my work as being work that centers the margins within Black theater and Black performance studies. So this second project, thinking about these Danish children actually these Black children who were owned by the Danish and put in cages to perform in Tivoli Gardens, thinking about how their experience and their histories are on the margins of what we understand as the history of Black exploitation, right? So inserting the Caribbean, inserting the lives of Black Caribbean children, and even thinking about plays such as August Wilson and other prominent plays, thinking about those unseen characters and those characters in the margins and what they are telling us and how they are informing us about Black life, and in pronounced ways, granting more depth to these plays. So that's how I come to this.
I guess I'll jump in. I come to this work from a place of, I attended a historically Black college and university, and being exposed to a rich history of Black artists and Black scholars and Black contributors to the field. I had the privilege of experiencing and exploring all of those things, but then jumping on the other side, attending a predominantly white institution, speaking with some of the undergraduate students during that time, not even knowing who August Wilson is in it. And we all know that August Wilson is usually one of the staples in all of the history books, him along with Lorraine Hansberry. But for them to not know this information of August Wilson, it sparked an interest in me thinking about how the curriculum development in historically Black colleges and universities are much more diverse in terms of what they present and how that could be translated in predominantly white institutions through the diversification of the curriculum, and not just using Black theater, Black performance as a special topics course, but more of a part of the American theater fabric, or a part of the theater fabric in general. So I come to it in that place. So yeah.
I'll go. I guess I come to at least the book. So the book Dark Matter and Breaking Ciphers, The Life of Africanist Aesthetics and Global Hip Hop, from two directions. One is just as a kid, loving breaking, loving hip hop, and growing up with that. And in starting graduate school and taking courses about African cultures in the Americas, and reading about Africanist aesthetics and a range of different things, recognizing that circles were so ubiquitous throughout the diaspora, and honestly just looking for sources to talk about circles and to make reference to ciphers, and realizing that there wasn't one. And so, like a lot of grad students, you look for the book that you realize that's the one you're supposed to be writing. But I had been interested in ritual cultures in the diaspora. I had been doing research on carnival practices throughout the diaspora. I had focused on African American, Afro-Caribbean literature and history. And in all of those studies, I wanted to spend time with rituals that I grew up with, that I understood. And ciphers were precisely that. And that opened the door to the larger research, which is really about thinking about how Africanist aesthetics live in a culture that isn't dominated by Black people or people who identify as being of or from the diaspora, but are very much invested in and embedded in that culture and a cultural identity that is, you can't take it away from the diaspora at the same time. So that's my interest.
I started off in performing arts doing dance. Dance was like how I expressed myself from the time I was, I don't know, I guess when I got out of my mom's womb, I was like ready to dance. And one of the styles of dance that most spoke to me was tap dance. And through being a tap dancer, discovering musical theater. And I didn't even realize this because I always used to say to people, many people will attest to this, that I was like, I don't like musicals. I don't like musical theater. Like, I don't get it. It don't make no sense to me. And I went to performing arts high school. I'm also from the Black Mecca, like Dr. Luckett, Atlanta. And sort of being a musical theater kid or being a theater kid meant that you were like obsessed with Rent or Sondheim and Wicked and all of those shows. And I didn't know anything about them. I wasn't necessarily interested in them. But one of the first professional musicals I saw when I was a kid was Crowns by Regina Taylor. And this musical that was authored by this Black woman told the story about Black girlhood and about the connection between Black women and intergenerational connections and all these wonderful things that it didn't realize at the time had begun to shape my interest in this world. And so part of I felt like my search throughout high school and undergrad and now in graduate school, working in the professional theater world, is just about nourishing the knowledges of Black women, especially beyond their contribution, their important contributions as performers, but also to how they have shaped the way we think about production and rehearsal and composition and writing. And so I feel like my entire scholarly journey is now being shaped to thinking about how Black women creators are thinking about form. We often get sort of thinking about content. So yeah, that's really shaped my thinking there.
Well, thank you everyone for such inspiring answers to that first question. And I will say anecdotally that I also started out as a tap dancer. God, I'm a dancer dances, and that led to my interest in musical theater as well. All right, so now we're going to go in a completely different direction, and I want to ask a question about citation. Black theater, dance, and performance studies scholars coincided not only in theater, dance, and performance studies, but also in Black studies. Opinions. And I'll read it again. Black theater, dance, and performance studies scholars coincided not only in theater, dance, and performance studies, but also in Black studies. Opinions.
I can start it off. This was one thing in the formation of my book this question that you posed, or this statement is something that was at the forefront of my mind in thinking about how to place the Chitlin Circuit. It is a musical, of course, it is African-American theater, of course, but it's also popular culture, and it's specifically Black popular culture. And I did a lot of work thinking about the work that Imani's doing. I did a lot of work and reading, thinking about parallel moments of Black popular culture, and hip hop was one of them, and thinking about the ways in which I was getting so much information from reading Black cultural scholars who were interested in hip hop and other forms of Black culture, but theater was not on the table. Theater was considered something on the margins or outside, or not even referenced. There's a few theater publications that deal with theater as Black popular culture, but it really is something aside from musicals writ large, right? Which then gets dominated by white musicals, right? I've had to find a way to not only document what was happening in this space in an ethnographic sense, but also the book, even in the titling, right? But the subtitle is in Black popular theater, right? I was really advocating for a dimension of visibility for Black theater that I think doesn't get enough attention. And also thinking about the ways in which Black theater, such as the Chitlin Circuit, can inform studies of Black religion, sociology, thinking about Black consumership, thinking about Black economy. So I think that I charge myself, I should say, with being a guide for our colleagues who are doing Black studies in other disciplines, and to say, hey, look over here. We have so much dynamism going on with Black theater and Black performance studies that we should all be at the same table, right?
I think for me, the sort of anti-theatrical bias tends to persist. I mean, this idea, like, for example, summer of 2020, the summer of anti-racist book lists, and the idea of performative entered the public discourse, right? Meant to mean something fictional, something faux, something that is feigned, something that is untrue. And I think that kind of framing about performance and about theater and about dance and cultural expression is still kind of not taken as seriously as a form of study and not taken as seriously as a form of intellectual production, though we here know that that's certainly not true. But even when we look at some of our most cited Black thinkers and philosophers, Du Bois, Sylvia Wynter, Aimé Césaire, the list goes on, they all were writers, they were artists, they were performers, and they were using the tools of theater to theorize about Black life. And so it is something that I would love to continue to have a conversation with in tandem with theater, dance, and performance studies and Black studies, because Black cultural expression is the way that we have been able to make this intellectual journey about how to stage or do or understand this thing called Blackness and how it's been shaped. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Maybe I can sort of pick up on what my colleagues have just said, because I'm always sort of fascinated by sort of the question of documentation, as well as, as the question sort of asks us to think about, what are the citational practices within Black performance cultures? And I think a lot of us, when we do our work, we actually see like, oh, what's coming out of, in some cases, minstrelsy. How does the Chitlin Circuit play with and against expectations of Black bodies? How does that transform into cultures of the Harlem Renaissance? What does it mean to perform in front of a white audience at the Cotton Club? And in my own research, what does it mean to perform in front of French and German audiences? And what I've discovered is that a lot of white scholars who will remain nameless, at least for right now, is that there's an element of surprise whenever there is sort of a Black performer in any space, as well as not being able to sort of find that lineage, just sort of saying this person sort of showed up full formed, or, in some cases saying like, naturally talented artists, and sort of not noticing, maybe not an institutional school, but at least some type of apprenticeship, some type of lineage that they're calling upon, and the ways that adds to the erasure of not being able to sort of say one generation performers help to train or work with the next generation. And then I think also thinking about not just Du Bois and other literary scholars, but discovering, for example, Claude McKay was a theater critic. It's one of his early jobs in New York City, and sees Shuffle Along, sees these other productions, and is writing to a Marxist left-leaning audience. I mean, there's ways of sort of saying it's not just about Black authors writing to other Black authors, but Black authors writing to a larger audience. And what is actually being passed on is really important, and also to, of course, notice those silences and those erasures when it comes to those interactions between Black artists, Black critics, their perhaps majority white audience, and those white audiences that might have specific ideological framings that might be called upon. I think that's really fascinating, and yeah, often gets buried.
I think I think there's a banking on the historical marginalization of Black bodies and white supremacy to allow it to keep happening. It happened to me, and I haven't spoken publicly about it necessarily, but I had an out-of-body experience when I saw the words and my name wasn't anywhere, or Tia and Schaefer's name wasn't anywhere. And I did what I could. I essentially wrote a public letter because the damage was done. And now what was interesting was I was expecting an apology from these non-Black scholars. And that didn't happen. What happened was they called us liars and said that they were using regular industry jargon. And that is a public letter as well. And so I'm guessing the book is going to continue. And it was particularly the description of Black acting methods on the book was they took the word Black and replaced it with Latinx. That's exactly what they did and moved sentences around. Anyway, so I'm looking to the field to see how the field is going to respond. And the cards are on the table. I always say that you can talk about that you are supporting Black folks, Black bodies, Black research, Black scholarship. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in your actions. What are you going to do? Because whether or not the publisher of this book continues the publication, we have power as scholars and artists to make sure the reach of the book, or what happens when the book is actually published with them calling me a liar. And so that's really personal, but again, I believe, and I don't know, I haven't spoken with them, but I believe it was the banking on the marginalization. Sharrell D. Luckett is a Black woman. This has happened to Black women historically. I can do this and I can get away with it. And not only can I do it and get away with it, I can call them liars and continue on with this book that I'm going to publish about Latinx acting methods. So so we just gotta keep moving forward. And I guess I'll put a pin in it right there before my emotions come out.
Anyone else want to jump in?
I mean, I feel like Sharrell's comment has us in a stronger direction, so I don't want to detract too much from that. But I do, on the one hand, I'm very much a proponent of like a politics of citing, Black folks, folks of color, women, just queer folks, just making sure that the conversations you're having are inclusive and engaged with a range of communities. But I think the challenge is like that. I think there are scholars who have learned that somebody needs to show up in their citations, but that's not the same as being reshaped by that scholarship. And so many of us doing work on Black stuff is what comes up is saying that like these categories produce certain kinds of erasures, or these understandings of how this thing is supposed to be in the world actually misses out on this whole other range of ways that, these ideas come up in Black cultures, in practice. So there's there's a distinction then in citing just to do a thing, to check a box, to say I cited a person of color, and really rethinking your work because of what the research says is doing. And then it's an entirely different thing to not even bother to cite, but also to straight up steal. And then know that historically there has been precedent for being able to take credit for that.
Dr. Williams?
Yeah, I actually immediately thought of Dr. Luckett when this question came up. And of course, it's not my story to tell, so I'm glad she gave voice to what happened. But it's just the mere fact that you can't even say you were inspired by, or you want to add on to the conversation of these diverse voices, of creating acting methods or ways of entering performance. It's just damaging to us in general, and for it to be done from our brown brothers and sisters is much more damaging, being that we should be, as a collective, fighting this good fight, and not fighting against each other, and really should be speaking out against this publisher and saying, hey, there was someone before me. There was someone who did this work before me, and I want to connect. I want to make sure that they are acknowledged, and we carry on this legacy, looking at this cultural perspective of Latinx culture.
Thank you again for your responses, everyone. And your responses actually lead me to my next question, which is about gatekeeping. Non-Black people, and particularly those who dabble in Black theater, dance, and performance, are both awarded and cited as the best stewards of the subject. Opinions. Non-Black people, and particularly those who dabble in Black theater, dance, and performance, are both awarded and cited as the best stewards of the subject. Opinions.
I just want to say the use of the word dabble is amazing to me. I think that word says so much. But I sort of am, in thinking about this session a lot, I was looking at our probably most prestigious award of the study of Black theater and performance, which is the Errol Hill Award. And in the recent issue, Milestones in Black Theater, that was published over the summer with Journal of American Drama and Theater. And I know folks both in the Zoom call and on this panel were published in that special issue, which I really enjoyed the way that was put together and the different types of essays there. And something that struck me when I was reading the list of winners of the Errol Hill Award is that the first award given was not to a Black theater scholar. And I believe it took 6 or so years to be awarded to a Black theater scholar. And the first woman to win the award was not awarded until a decade after the award was, first Black woman to win the award was not until a decade after the award was established. And I only looked deeply at these numbers and at this award because, I mean, we have this thing that's like one of our biggest recognitions of the study of and scholarship of Black theater and performance. And we have, you know, it took so long just for Black and or African-American or folks of the diaspora who identify as Black to win something that, you know, recognizes that scholarship. It makes you question about what is being valued in this world and in this work. It reminds me of Patricia Hill Collins in Black Feminist Thought, where she talks about how Black women's ideas have been invited into the academy without actual Black women being there. It's like the ideas, the creativity, the skill, and the artistry of Black people are being celebrated in text form, but what does that actually mean? To go back to Dr. Luckett and Dr. Williams bringing up these questions around the actual erasure of Black bodies, right, within the Black personhood when it comes to the study of scholarship. I mean, even a lot of the honorable mentions were Black when the actual awardees were not. And so I think materially and tangibly, just looking at something like that, it's always jarring to me to see that happen. And again, not saying whether or not people deserved or not is subjective, and you can make your own decisions of that. But I think, like, in terms of what are we actually recognizing and celebrating within the scholarship of this, are questions that I continue to come back to when thinking about how hard it is to be a Black theater scholar. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I just want to name that this question was in part inspired by the winners and the honorable mentions of the Errol Hill Award, and not just in the early years, as you just mentioned, but also in recent years as well. In one year, there was one winner and then 3 honorable mentions, none of whom are Black. And I think what I find disappointing about that is all of our colleagues in Black theater, dance, and performance studies, yourselves included, who are doing this work, but who are not being recognized in the same way by their professional organizations.
I mean, it's a valuing of white institutions and white bodies in that way as well, right? Because I'm thinking about this, but recently I find myself, anytime, it's interesting because it can be a Black playwright, but anytime now a Black playwright is thrown on my radar and they're just blowing up, I'm always curious about who's vetting them and why. You know, and there are certain plays recently that I was like, how in the world did this get to off-Broadway? How did this get to Broadway? Who thought this was a good idea in the Black community? And it's a Black person there, but they're not the one vetting the work, you know? So I think that's another way to think about this conversation too. And I've heard many Black scholars talk about this, but the way we value these white institutions, I'm not interested in what you think is good Black work. So we also have to take a step back and also recognize when I'm going to say culturally Black too. When culturally Black people are not in the room, and their awards being given out for Blackness, I'm not interested most of the times. That needs to change. That needs to change. And how you decide if somebody's culturally Black, I'm not gonna say that's subjective neither, but you'd ask your friend if so-and-so is culturally Black. Ask a couple of Black folks and see what answers you get, because we have to be careful again with Black bodies valuing these white institutions and what these white folks have to say about Black work. The Errol Hill Award is amazing, you know. I'm gonna stop there. I see you, Imani.
Your point is well taken, though. I mean, certainly in terms of musical theater writers and playwrights, Black ones, who are being produced professionally, I often ask myself the same questions that you're posing to us about why and why now. And oftentimes it is because these are Black artists who participate in white people's anti-Blackness and their racism. And so I think you're absolutely right. That's an element of this discussion that we shouldn't dismiss either.
One thing I want to sort of jump in with, and I actually think this goes to what we're talking about. I mean, when we think about what it means to do different forms of labor, one element is, as scholars, as people who are working, writing, collaborating with concepts of Black theater and Black performance, one thing we want to do, or at least one version that I hope is not too egocentric, is we want our work to sort of extend outward and to help other people and to work with other people, and for that to always be part of our process. And one of the things I also think about when it comes to either the awards or who's vetting who is, imagining our culturally Black colleagues who are probably over labored and cannot spend the time that they perhaps also need to not only vet work, but to have those really critical conversations. I mean, I think this sort of speaks to the ways in which Black scholars, Black theater makers are often, little islands in a big white sea. And it's sometimes hard to even imagine themselves being able to put up the correct defenses or offenses against sort of white supremacy. And that's not me excusing, whatever bad Black theater may or may not be happening, but to think about the ways in which, institutionally, all of us are often siloed off from sort of being able to create really strong networks to be able to combat things like white supremacy in off-Broadway, let alone Broadway.
I have sort of an unfinished thought that this question has stirred for me, and this conversation is that we're having right now is amazing. To even thinking about Paul's comments, just thinking about us being able to even have this conversation collectively, right, and name these things in this kind of platform, I think is very important. Teaching at a predominantly white institution, right, and an elite predominantly white, private white institution, this is, the pipeline has become very important for me, right, as a Black scholar, and who is in my classroom, and then the kind of work that I'm teaching them to do, and then what bodies then hold that knowledge and then proceed and go forth with it. And it's something that I haven't quite figured out yet, right? Just sort of how I feel about not necessarily who I'm teaching to, but the fact that at my institution, my classes are predominantly white, right? My students are predominantly white. Now, I do have a history of Black and Brown students who are interested in pursuing a PhD in African-American studies or African-American history, African-American theater. And those students self-identify because they are often a part of the Mellon Mays Foundation, and they are doing the work during the school year. But there is something about, there's a lot I can say about my Black body in this space, being the arbiter through which this knowledge is gained. And I have phenomenal students of every race, but I think the pipeline is rather interesting also, as much as and I think that ties to the labor as well, right? Because we are now a part of the generation of teachers, and we are passing on this knowledge, right? And our classrooms are very diverse. And then there's a continuation of diversity going into these graduate PhD programs with perhaps a desire to continue the work that they had with these Black scholars, right? So I just want to put that on the table, and I'm still grappling with it every day.
Yeah, I also think that this speaks directly to the performative nature of diversifying the field. Yes, we want your Black content, but we don't want the Black bodies who produce the content. And finding that oh, these white scholars or non-Black scholars are very revolutionary, and ignoring the fact the years upon years of intellectuals and scholars who's been doing this work for a long time. But because we're in this social justice movement, because we're in this moment of diversity and inclusion, oh, we're going to give this award to this non-Black person, but doing that Black thing. But there's a long history of all of these Black scholars who's been doing this Black thing for years upon years, and you still have yet to really acknowledge them and give them the kudos that they very much deserve. And they're not dabbling in this field. It is something that they're passionate about. It's something that they live on a day-to-day basis. And it's an experience that they want to bring forth from an authentic place, and not just to be recognized or to receive this award or to say, I'm doing something revolutionary.
I think what's coming up for me in this conversation is that, one, like, these are obviously conversations that we've all had before, which is to say they're not new, which is, and I don't mean that in a way, like, I'm not saying it's been done. I'm saying like there's a kind of stuckness, in part because of the way, like, you know, white supremacy adapts. So then this moment of like, everybody's, you know, gonna oppose and we're gonna work against anti-Blackness, white supremacy adapts, and then we laud those white folks who can do the thing well in front of audiences, and, you know, who can gesturally say there are Black people writing on this, and like who can hit those markers. And I think for me, what came up, especially in writing the article I wrote on appropriation, was like, there both needs to be a way that those of us who are ready can move to a different kind of conversation, which is to say, how do we start to strategize knowing in advance that that thing happens? How do we move differently knowing that that thing is gonna happen? And recognize that even having that conversation makes it easily co-optable. Like, I hesitated to write an article about moving, I said beyond, but I really mean like expanding how we talk about cross-racial performance in a way that isn't fully encompassed by appropriation discourse. But I hesitated because I knew that that opened the door for non-Black folks, but, you know, historically and in my own personal experience, white folks going like, that's what I'm doing. I'm appreciating, not appropriating, and therefore I still don't have to attend to my BS around race and Blackness. And it's that permissive space to give yourself room to not address race, to not address Blackness in your world, in your studies, in your field, and in the institutions. Like, if all of those things are anti-Black, if all of those things we already know are socialized to be or institutionalized to be anti-Black, like, you can't absolve yourself of that labor. And I think that for white folks who are here and interested in this conversation, that room to absolve yourself of a labor of attending to race because you're white is exactly where you're supposed to be doing the work. And if you're not, you are absolutely who we are talking about here. And so I think that part of what comes up for me here is that for my Black colleagues, like, what do our next steps look like? What do our future conversations look like? So that it's not just rehashing things that in the Black community we already know. Like, this is common knowledge. Like, of course, Elvis is the king of rock and roll. Of course, at some point in time, Benny Goodman was the king of jazz. Like, whatever nonsense, Eminem, the king of rap. Like, that is so predictable. Like, white supremacy is so predictable in that. So what do we do differently, at the very least, to not get caught up in explaining to white folks that this is bullshit, and it continues to be. So that's, I guess, where I land in that conversation.
Again, thank you all for your wonderful responses to my question. I want to flag that we have approximately 20 minutes or so remaining in the discussion. And so for those of you in the audience, if you have any questions that you would like to ask of us on the panel, please get ready to write them in the chat. But I'm going to pose one more question to the panel that I think is also relevant to much of what has been said so far. And that question is, what does it mean and why does it matter that increasingly Black people are seldom successful candidates yielded in searches in Black theater, dance, and performance history? What does it mean and why does it matter that increasingly Black people are seldom successful candidates yielded in searches in Black theater, dance, and performance history? And I want to name that this question is inspired in part by the fact that this academic year, there are a few open positions in Black theater and history at Amherst College, 2 actually at New York University and other places.
I'll jump in. I think this goes back to what I was saying with the question before. Wanting the content, but not wanting the person. Pretending that you really want the full knowledge, the knowledge from people who actually study this on a day-to-day basis and not dabble in it because it's something that they feel is an untapped area of research. I think it's not that, of course, it's not that we're unqualified and we shouldn't be awarded with these positions. It's more of, let me just answer a part of the student's demand or the student's ask, which is, let us have that content. Let us explore Black theater and performance. Let us explore those very lived experiences, but we don't want to do it by way of a Black scholar who's doing the work and who has done the work for years. We're still going to give it to our non-Black colleagues to fill that space because we want to make sure that they're rising in the ranks and they have a place at the table versus us having a place at the table.
I mean,
And
I think,
I just want to say, I want to echo Imani really fast. The question you posed earlier, you know, we've had these conversations before. I think that, I don't want to call it danger, but the lifespan, you know, of a human is like, what is it? I don't know, y'all. So let me not make up no numbers, but I hope I live to be 100 and something. But, you know, somewhere in the 70s, 80s, somewhere in there, you know, and I bring that up because if we really look at history as Black people, we would not be surprised that this is happening. It is the persistence of white supremacy, and it's and there's nothing in the past that has shown us that white folks are going to change. So as Imani was saying, we got to hold ourselves accountable as Black people and ask where we are and not be so surprised that when they're looking for Black studies that they're about to hire a white person. We can't be surprised. And the reason I brought up because I think if our ancestors were still here, you know, from hundreds of years ago, they would be like, baby, what you doing? Why was y'all still doing this? You know, okay, let's figure out a way to how we can, you know, look at our Sankofa, looking at the history and coming up and what it is. I'd be happy when we figured out, Imani. I really will. And you know, I want to say quickly that I'm not quite so sure that that we haven't figured it out. I just don't know if everybody has gotten on board, you know. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
I was just going to add that Like, we know that when it comes to job hires, that it's not just about who's the best scholar for the position. It's about who people feel like they can get along with, who's going to be on their side in internal politics in the department, who's going to look good on this, and who's going to do circulate in the world like this, and that. And so when it comes down to that interpersonal dynamic, again, this is where just a history of engaging Black culture without Black people, it facilitates, you know, a comfort for white folks. And that comfort, when it's contested by an actual Black body in the room who's saying, like, I don't agree with that, or that's actually problematic, that discomfort is precisely where those decisions get made. Like, this person is more versatile, this person, da-da-da. I've, you know, done, I've recommended, say, street dancers to teach at universities, and particularly when they're street dancers of color, most of the questions I get are like, can they talk to our students? Are they gonna be okay? Like, it's variations of that. And I'm doing the translation work of like bridging this place, these folks, because I don't want that all to be on that person once they get there. And I understand that from my position, so I'll do that, but it's also just like, ugh, the same old, same old. And so, yeah.
In support of what has been said just recently, particularly by Imani and Sharrell, I just also want to just reiterate the problem that this poses for the pipeline, because, you know, as we know, those of us who have studied this in college and university settings, what happens when there is no Black faculty in these theater spaces is that Black students become disenfranchised, disillusioned, ignored within these spaces, and then therefore the line is broken, right? And so it's all of this, you know, these acts, these supremacist acts are really damaging and destroying at the root, right? The potential for these, you know, going to the awards question, for these things to be rerouted and, you know, us to be really deeply acknowledged for the work that we've been doing historically, right? So I'll stop there, but just echoing that all of this is important, and it goes down to what is then the effect on the student, right? To sort of continue this work.
And sorry, go ahead, Eric.
No, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I also just want to build off of what Rashida has been bringing up, thinking about the pipeline. And, you know, very quickly, I won't linger on it. Rashida, I'm a Wesleyan graduate, so like I feel very much that element. I was a music major, and, you know, we can have a whole conversation about it. But thinking about the pipeline or the circuits, I'm sure many of us in getting our PhDs or in our own our own performance training had white advisors, white directors, white people who are working with us. And at times they would be, you know, over the moon saying, how phenomenal, how great you are. But being able to really understand not so much that, you know, white and Black or white and diaspora divide, but, you know, are these scholars, are these people we're working with who are understanding the culture, understanding the literature, understanding the scholarship, and are they passing that on not only to their Black students or the white students, but is this proliferating? And so I often think about, you know, the graduate students who may be really interested in a topic, but because of the advisor they have, they are not actually getting the full picture. They don't even know who Errol Hill is to sort of even understand the import of why there's a word named after him. And so, you know, to what we've been talking about, there are just so many ways in which Black scholarship can just end up in a dead end and doesn't get to be part of those conversations. And so we do get the theater makers, as well as the dissertation advisors who, you know, they have that really smart student and they are just not giving that student the resources they need. And they're just reinventing the wheel over and over again until, you know, they attend this session or something else that sort of like invigorates them to sort of see how strong the field actually is. And I actually think that that's a really important point, is like, you know, luckily it's not just us on this panel. There are so many wonderful scholars of color who do this work, and it's really hard to find each other. And, you know, that's just something that feels like very apparent when we think about what happens when it comes to job searches and who gets a position and who they get to work with.
And if I can also jump in, is well, I'm not a faculty member, so I can't really speak to like job searches. All I can hope is all I can hope. But I will say that my trajectory in doing graduate work was definitely enhanced by the fact that I do have an advisor who is Black and studies Black theater, and is a practitioner of Black theater. And so, like, if I can't speak to the sort of material, like why it does or doesn't happen, I can speak to what happens when it does happen. Is that I feel like when you're a Black theater scholar, you, in many ways, you have to see it being done to know that it can be done. Because in theater faculty, when you look at these programs, I mean, for example, that was something that was very important to me, to have a Black advisor as a PhD student. And when I was on the market some odd years ago, there were only 3 places that I could apply where that could happen. And I don't have no idea if that number has grown at all since then, but I do know that it was difficult to find that in many different ways. And so, and that's why a lot of wonderful Black theater and performance scholarship doesn't actually happen in a lot of theater and performance studies programs, because oftentimes Black scholars have to go to other programs in order to do their work, because that's where, I don't know, where they can find other sources, they can find other people who specialize in that, whatever it might be. Oftentimes it can be quite isolating in theater and theater, dance, and performance studies programs, because we know why. We know why that happens. And so that erasure and that marginalization was exactly what I wanted to combat against, at least when I was, figuring out where to study to do the work that I wanted to pursue as a graduate researcher. And we see all these initiatives and cluster hires and everything like that. And so I'm curious to see what yields from these searches, because it certainly has not been reflected as much, at least from my vantage point. So we'll see what happens. But as Dr. Luckett, Dr. Johnson have already pointed out, it ain't look so good.
You also make a great point, Jordan, about the fact that many of our quote unquote senior or leading scholars in Black theater, dance, and performance are not members of theater, dance, and performance studies organizations, but they do go to the American Studies Association annual convention or the Modern Language Association of America annual conference. And building off of something that Dr. Edwards and also Dr. McMahon said, I've taught on and off, back and forth, in conservatories and also in liberal arts colleges. And I have this theory that when I meet students of all races, but particularly Black students, I can tell whether or not they have been taught Black theater history by a Black professor or Black theater history by someone who is not Black. And in the latter case, what often happens is that student parrots or reproduces many of the racist and white supremacist ideas about Black people and theater history that they learned from their non-Black professor. And as an instructor, it can always be a challenge to help that student unlearn much of what they have been taught by non-Black people about this field. So we have approximately 6 minutes left. I'm not seeing any questions from any of our attendees in the chat, which is neither a good thing nor a bad thing. But how about lasting thoughts If any of you have any lasting thoughts about anything that we have discussed during today's session, or perhaps something that we have not discussed yet, what would that be?
I was just going to piggyback really fast. And I would say, since I believe there are a lot of folks on here, hire the Black person. It's not hard. Hire the Black person. Hire the Black person.
Hear, hear.
If I could also add to the chorus, one of the things that we have been, I think, most familiar in hearing is, save the humanities, right? The humanities are falling. There needs to be all of this sort of concerted effort into saving the humanities, but it's actually Black studies that needs to be saved. And I think about this in terms of hiring practices. I think about this in terms of faculty retention. I think about this in terms of the pipeline that I've been sort of inserting, and we need to save Black scholars. And we also need, as Black scholars, I think we also have to do the work to save ourselves, right? And so there's a lot more. This is, again, is not this is a refrain that has been heard before, but I think it's worth putting it on the table, right? And putting it into the universe, how important it is to save ourselves under these conditions. And hire the Black faculty.
Yes, agreed. That sentiment, we could put it on like a t-shirt. I would, yes, hire the Black person for sure. And also deal with whiteness first. I think, like, I get this question a lot of like, how can I diversify my research? How can I bring more people of color into my, or what is the term, BIPOC? How can I bring that into my research? How can I make sure that I'm talking about folks of color, about Black people? And I'm like, well, have you sufficiently dealt with whiteness first in your research? Have you sufficiently understood this racialized, whiteness as a racial project in and of itself, and how that shaped your research and your project? And once that is kind of, once we get there, maybe we can think about other stuff, but like oftentimes I find that how white supremacy and whiteness has shaped theater and dance and these extant projects within our field is just not even touched upon. It's like you're trying to study all these other communities when you haven't even sufficiently dealt with your own relationship to your research and how this system of power has shaped your interest in whatever community that you're interested in studying. And so that's something that I'd like to be more further addressed. And like, I don't think that we should have to be the ones to further address that. And again, hire the Black person.
This is perhaps a half formulated idea, but I was thinking about Imani's work with appropriation and cross-racial performance. And, I'm trying not to be glib or silly, but there is like part of me that just wants us to create the real Arrow Hill Award and then just like offer like a shadow award response or some type of shadow response to sort of the overall structures that formulate what is sort of appropriate scholarship and appropriate work, and to sort of say, actually, the real award goes to this, and actually it goes to this. And, there's a way in which that won't work, but just thinking back to concepts of appropriation, but, it would be really interesting to think about the role of Black scholars, Black performers, and the legacies of African diaspora and the idea of the trickster to sort of like appropriate back all these concepts and try to do something not new with them, but to at least just offer a challenge to whiteness and how we create and think about what our work is, and sort of offer a real challenge in some respects in terms of when these awards and fellowships come up. There is not a lot of financial power we have to do a lot of these things, but I'm at least tickled by the idea of doing something to just sort of mess with white supremacist structures.
I guess my closing thoughts are actually more towards Jordan, because your comment about like, us noting how crappy things are made me feel away because I was like, I don't want to leave you with that. But ultimately, I guess part of what I want to say is that like the things that you're already doing, like, when Eric read your bio, I was like, okay, sis, in grad school and still like this and this and this and this and this, publishing this, working on this, like those are the things that are going to set you up professionally. And whether that ends up looking like some PWI hiring you, or it looks like you create something that wasn't in the world because of how you move through the world, that, like, to me, your priority and your energy needs to be to continue to create, continue to just do what you do and create the platforms to do it, create the networks that give you room to do it, and supporting each other. One of the things Eric told me when he created this panel was just this opportunity to have a conversation with each other, to build more networks, to expand that. And that's something that we need to continue to do. It's not a master checklist. I'm looking at some of the comments in the chat, like the things to do. Where do I look? What are the binders of people I didn't, that kind of thing. There are sources you can, Google, you can talk to individuals and they can tell you things, but that's not the work. And because there's so much that needs to happen within institutions, continuing to do what you do, continuing to build and connect is, to me, the primary focus, because it's not an award, it's a job. They're getting something from you, absolutely. So set yourself up in a way where it's real clear that what they're getting, they can't simply fill in with somebody else.
And Dr. Williams?
I'll end with this. I think even when we're hired and when we're at these predominantly white institutions, the white institutions need to support us and not police what we're doing, police our practice, police our research, and provide us the space to do what we do. Because otherwise it makes for dissatisfied Black faculty in these spaces, which perpetuates the idea of not having us even in these programs and presenting this information. So support, hire and support Black faculty.
All right. And so we are officially out of time, unfortunately. Today is my birthday, and I turned 26 for the 11th time. And this is the best present that I could have asked for. I really enjoyed engaging in this conversation with you. I hope the conversation continues well after today. And if you are going to the ASTR conference in San Diego, I will see you there. But if not, I will see you when I see you. Take care, everyone, and have a nice day.